Coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
The political predicaments and the instability of regimes and the struggle to reestablish political authority coming out of, frankly, the Reformation seemed intractable. Not a lot of room for all of these peoples to share. And, we saw the intractability of those problems extend right up through 1945 and beyond in some ways. But what brought it to an end is something that the founders would not have countenanced: weapons of mass destruction, a secret government, a state within a state in the United States that was basically a military scientific government, creating weapons capable of destroying millions of lives in an instant. And even that, yes, that sort of finally knocked the soul out of Europe to such a degree that they kind of crawled into the EU and curled up into a ball and waited for the pain to go away, which, checking in on Europe, seems the pain has not yet gone away. So, not an unmitigated win there, even by the low standards of scorched earth policy.
Hello and welcome once again to the Roundtable, your weekly publishers and editors podcast here at the American Mind. I'm your host, Spencer Clavin, features editor at the American Mind and associate editor at the Claremont Review of Books, and I am back, baby. Thanks to the guys for holding down the fort while I was gone on vacation in Egypt, which rocked. I am joined this week, glad to be back, and joined by editor James Poulos, managing editor Seth Barron, and publisher and president Ryan Williams. So it seems like a pretty uneventful week that I chose to leave. Nothing much happened. No, I'm just kidding. Actually, I indulged in some blissful ignorance while I was away and would occasionally pop my head up on Twitter to find that once again, the room is burning down. This is fine. Dumpster fires everywhere. The latest of which we didn't quite get to cover on last week's pod because it happened on Friday, is the new Donald Trump indictment. So this is the one arising from the raid on Mar-a-Lago, the allegation that Trump has not only mishandled, but now withheld classified documents from the government. There are 37 counts in this indictment. And importantly, for reasons that I'm sure we'll get into, these counts are mostly about not having the documents, but about refusing to hand them over. And there are a number of pieces of evidence, audio recordings, text messages, and stuff that purport to show that not only was he not intending to hand them over, he was actually intending to hide them. His valet, Walt Nauta, has also been sort of wrapped up in this because it was Trump's intention. The allegation goes to, have his various minions and people, including Nauta, but also some of his lawyers, either remove the documents from the government's purview or else just destroy some of the most damning ones altogether. There are also recordings of Trump saying things like, as president, I could have declassified it. That is one of these documents. Now I can't, but this is still a secret. And this was all apparently as part of his efforts to settle a score, I guess, with General Milley, that it was Milley's idea to attack Iran and not Trump's. Anyway, all of this by way of saying we are back on the is Trump going to jail train, essentially. The arraignment has already taken place, and now in Miami, the case will move forward. We've got an editor's note up about this. It's called Welcome to Your New Country on the site on AmericanMind.org. There's lots to unpack here, but I think the first question that I want to ask you guys is, do you think they got him this time? Is this one the one that they finally get what they've always wanted, which is Trump in jail, or at least out of the picture.
No, the opposite seems to be the case. I mean, it's only been a couple days, but it's interesting the durability of the top two polling numbers, that is Trump and DeSantis in the primary. They're basically unmoved for months. You know, they fluctuate a little bit, maybe a little up and down, but it's 40 whatever percent Trump, 20 whatever percent, or maybe it's even low 50s Trump, 20 whatever percent DeSantis, and everyone else is now 5, 4, 4, 4, 2. I was discussing this with our colleague Bill Vogley at lunch the other day, and I know our listeners are all over the map on who's inevitable, who's going to win the primary, who should, et cetera, versus Trump or DeSantis. And I was also talking to our friend and colleague Jeremy Carl, and Jeremy and Bill are sober analysts of politics. They're not they're seasoned hands. They've been doing this for a long time. Bill longer than Jeremy, of course, but the verdict from them is, a lot of this is just noise at this point. People, other folks, they tend to be disproportionately much more MAGA than DeSantis in our circles, would say that it's obvious Trump has it locked down. The indictments only make him stronger. But I just like to emphasize and reemphasize that it's just a long time between now and the Iowa caucuses. I'm a broken record now. I think I said this last week, maybe the week before. So I think a lot of this is, at this stage, it's positioning. It's our new-ish phenomenon over the last decade, maybe, or maybe a little less, of polls as vehicles of narrative and information or misinformation rather than as real readers of reality. So, but at the macro level, Spencer, to answer your question, I return to my original quick answer, which is this does not seem to have any prospect, this kind of lawfare against Trump, unprecedented in various ways as it is, as we'll get into, does not seem to weaken him at all. In fact, on a personal level, it seems to energize him and bring him back up to his game, and distracts him from flailing around insulting DeSantis or whatever, and refocuses him on what he's best at, which is standing as the avatar against the establishment. And so, if we had a more, this is all, I'll just stop with this. I'm kind of rambling, but this is also I think a standing data point is a stupid phrase, but another data point in the sense in which, while it makes a certain amount of sense to talk of the regime in contemporary America, meaning the center of gravity of modern liberalism and what it thinks is just and all the rest, and the media, et cetera, et cetera. If this was really a top-down conspiracy that was very intelligent, they wouldn't have made a series of blunders like indicting Trump on flimsy/unprecedented charges, because it just seems to embolden him, embolden his followers, and maybe even cause a certain amount of possible sympathetic vote from folks who otherwise would abhor him.
Yes, but does the indictment hold up? Yes, it's ridiculous. Yes, we all know it's selective prosecution. Yes, Hillary, Pence, Sandy Berger, Bill Clinton, Biden, everybody did the same thing. There's millions of people with top secret security clearance. Probably half of them have stuff in their email or on their desk or wherever that they shouldn't. But they've lined it up to get Trump.
Yeah.
Will they convict him? It seems like they could. On the other hand, they need a unanimous verdict with a Florida jury.
Yeah, Palm Beach County. Yeah.
And a pro-Trump judge. So, it's like a weird, but you're totally right, Ryan. This is exactly where he likes to be.
Yeah. Right in the briar patch.
Trudging up to Calvary.
Yeah.
And everybody, all of his supporters, and who can't get behind him on this because it's so ludicrous. At the same time, the fact that they're going after his valet and his lawyers, they really are dirty, right? They'll just put the screws to everybody. They don't care. I don't know. It does seem as though, him saying, telling people, okay, we have to hide this one from the lawyers and hide that one from the FBI.
Yeah.
That is, obstruction of justice.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, sure.
There's a certain level of, well, and just another, and look, I voted for Trump twice. I would again, just for the record. But it's the normal and repetitive difficulty of execution and just general level of dumbassery that accompanies Trump. It's on evidence here in this whole thing. It's like the whole world is after you, and yet still you can't exercise just a little bit of discipline to keep yourself out of hot water. It's just, and I say that conceding completely that the whole thing is corrupt and illegitimate.
Yeah, I mean, that part of it is sort of damning. Also, if he's unable to kind of muster lawyers who can really take the prosecution to task on this stuff, that will be a bad sign for his ability to take on the deep state better in a new term than he did in his first term. Like, all of that, I will freely concede. But of course, Seth, the point you're making is kind of the crucial one, which is that this is literally an example of that thing we're always talking about, where they know he's guilty, and so they just have to decide how to carve out the law so that Trump is guilty and no one else is. Like, the whole point of the fact that this indictment is about the obstruction of justice and retaining the documents, it seems to me, that is to carve out this space where it's that's the thing that we actually prosecute. Having the documents is fine as long as you hand them over when we ask you for them. And that enables them to be Biden, Pence, whatever. But Trump is the real problem, which is always the predetermined conclusion. It's as they're just trying to find something that Trump only has done. And he does kind of give it to them. As Ryan, as you're saying, this is not a person that has exhibited a ton of discipline or self-control. My take on will they get him is they don't seem to have set themselves up perfectly for it. It's not out of the question in my view, but yeah, they only need one juror to be unsure, to give them the benefit of the doubt. Something I didn't say in my intro is that this is a special prosecutor, Jack Smith, who brings this stuff. But Miami is kind of known for speedy resolutions of trials. And this is, in Florida, because Mar-a-Lago's in Florida. So Trump will probably not want it to go straight through. He'll want to delay until 2024 or whatever. But we'll see how the whole thing plays out. I do think that, yeah, it's hard to imagine getting a unanimous jury to convict him for this, not in part because it's so nakedly selective and so designed to carve a Trump-shaped hole in the law and only prosecute within that region and leave all these other corrupt clowns kind of to run the country.
There's kind of an old chestnut about how, in strategic matters and even just dealing with people's personalities, strengths can also be weaknesses. And it can be very difficult to pry or to sift out one from the other, depending on the situation and the balance of power or advantages. I think the dream scenario here for Trump people is, well, yes, they might not let him into office ever again. And, well, yes, he might be running a little bit more to the left now, and that's not ideal, but neither is anything else. And yes, it's possible that he could end up behind bars and so on and so forth. But after all, we are in a revolutionary moment, and the only way that we are going to actually be able to win is by knocking out the regime. And the only way that we can knock out the regime is by luring it into a position where it becomes unable to destroy Trump without unleashing a huge counterforce across the country. And it seems that, this regime is not, they're not sending their best. And the harder they wage this very particular and very unprincipled and very unconstitutional kind of lawfare against one man, one very orange man, the more susceptible they are to getting out ahead of their skis or outrunning their supply lines, whatever sort of, quasi-military metaphor you want to use. They are exposing themselves to sort of self-induced failure mode. And it does seem to be the case that there just isn't anyone maybe on planet Earth who's capable of causing the regime to overreact and undermine its legitimacy in the way that Donald Trump does. Whether or not it's worth chancing it that this will end up worse off for the regime than for America or for the right, these things, you can't feed that into ChatGPT and like get the answer. These are deeply human things. These are spiritual things. These are the times that sometimes they separate the men from the boys. Sometimes they separate the fools from the people who will be around after the dust settles. So it's just going to be hard. And the gut check involved in sort of deciding, whether you're willing to just go for broke or not is going to have something to do with, your assessment as to whether this is a kind of like, this one's for all the marbles. Not clear whether it's for all the marbles. And I think that you can say that even if you are extraordinarily pessimistic about the direction of the country and the malevolence of the deep state or the unelected class or the administrative state, the blob, the Borg, whatever you want to call them. I think here, just going back to Ryan's remarks, one of the strange virtues of this perhaps overlong campaign season is that it does give everyone a little bit more of a runway to kind of slow down the tempo of events a little bit and try to just process reality. It's challenging even for career observers. And so it's really challenging for ordinary Americans, especially ordinary Americans who, are just plain too busy and too overcommitted in their own lives to like really process what's going on. And or those who are already just so jaded that they're like, well, both sides are corrupt. The whole system sucks. Maybe it'll fall apart, but I'm not going to be out there in the streets pulling it down. It's a small mercy that we do have at least a little bit of time to just size things up a little more discerningly. The broad contours are obvious. What's at stake is obvious. How all the pieces fit together, how much risk is too much risk, where boldness turns into foolishness, those are not quite as obvious. And I guess it looks like we'll have at least the summer to reflect a little more deeply on those things.
What is it that they hope to accomplish with this? It seems like it's like burning down your it's like starting a fire in your bedroom because you don't want to do your homework. Like this will. Do the Democrats think that by doing this they will achieve like permanent supremacy? Do they not understand that this like is such a massive delegitimizing effort that it will alienate half the country? That like it'll just cast complete cynicism and doubt and skepticism about America throughout the world. I mean, to what extent America has any, still has any, sense of authority regarding its democratic institutions and whatnot. This just seems like it's such a profound self-own. Like, why would you do this? Even if you can.
But don't you think they're betting on just already the kind of gentle acquiescence to banana republicdom already having settled over the rapidly aging American populace, like that we're just going to go gently into that good night, and they're just trying to put that last nail in the coffin. Like that's how this feels to me. Like if they can just get this like pesky orange glitch out of the system, swat this one fly, then we'll all just kind of acquiesce and roll along. I mean, I think that's a drastic miscalculation, but it does seem like, they are hoping for that perpetual control without like a real hot civil war or a fight or whatever else. Like they're just hoping this will kind of be a gradual transition into autocracy,
I guess.
So we'll see how that works out. Bold move, Cotton. It's a bold move, Cotton. Let's see how it plays.
People should. This is like the fourth time, at least, I've cited this essay. on here. I think in partial answer to you, Seth, it's that not just liberals, but modern Westerners in general, for a variety of reasons, probably U.S. Westerners more than, say, continental maybe, or even British of a certain flavor, are poorly educated in history and the history of regimes. And so I just point everyone to Angelo Codavilla's one of the great essays ever published at the American Mind, and still the most read, one of the most read, America's Revolutionary Logic, which, you know, with a lot of reference to ancient Thucydidean tragedy and regime tragedies in the Peloponnesian War and elsewhere, makes your point, Seth, which is like, do they not realize, and it harkens back to James' point, that they're playing with fire, that they're, you know, that fire might spread from the room to the rest of the house and burn the whole thing down. I think there's a remarkable, an unwarranted, sanguine approach to all this by the powers that be. And, you know, like what was Jim Swift? Is that the prosecutor's name, Jim Swift? What was his education? I doubt it's very good or very deep. And so these questions are not questions of strict legalisms. I mean, they're questions of politics and questions of regime stability. And they're questions that would have been taken for granted as having had to be answered in a political way rather than a merely legalistic way by probably every generation of responsible politician up until like 50 or 70 years ago. And we'll get into this with what we talk about next, I think. But I think it's also the product of the sort of Hegel's influence and the influence of progressivism. That is to say, certain problems become permanently solved. That is, no, this regime will never collapse. No, we'll never descend into tyranny or civil war because, you know, we've progressed. We're better than our past folks. History results ultimately in perfect justice. It's now just a matter of technical calculation. And Trump is the aberration, and his you know, fervent followers are a dying breed of persons, ideologically, if not demographically, in the United States. And like we're right on the cusp, right on the cusp. It's the same sort of animating forces that greeted, that sort of made everyone, not everyone, but made a huge portion of the ruling class of America kind of freak out and go into permanent partial psychosis over Trump besting Hillary in 2016.
Yeah, history is inevitable, and that's why we must do everything in our power to hasten it, is like the classic contradiction.
We just if we do this.
Yeah, right.
Then fix Trump finally, then heaven on earth. It's like right around the corner. Why are you all standing in our way? You're crazy.
Yeah, just one more trans surgery, just one more like breach of the public trust. But wait, Ryan, wait until I read you the first paragraph of this New York Times description of it's Jack Smith, the special counsel.
Jack Smith, thank you. Yeah.
And as soon as I read this Deathless Prose by Glenn Thrush to you, you will immediately reverse your opinion about our elite. Jack Smith, appointed in November to investigate former President Donald J. Trump, is a hard-driving, flinty veteran Justice Department prosecutor chosen for his experience in bringing high-stakes cases against politicians. And he also has such a strong jawline and piercing blue eyes. I'm sorry, no, I added that part in myself. Yeah, okay. So obviously, as James indicates, we will have time to watch how things unfold. It's nice to divide things into stuff you can control and stuff you can't. I basically know that I will be voting for a Republican potato if we put one up in 2024, and until, other than that, all we can do is sort of wait and see what happens. Let us chat now about something a little bit more esoteric, although it did make the rounds on the internet, and that is the back and forth, let's say, over a piece by Malcolm Kyeyune, I think is how you say that. I conferred with Ryan about this beforehand, and the piece is about Elbridge Colby. This is one of our kind of, I would say, primary national defense strategists. He has written just one book called The Strategy of Denial, American Defense in an Age of Great Power Conflict. And the piece is sort of a review of that book, but it really is a very careful and I thought quite interesting assault on the notion of realism as a kind of, or let's say the realists who have emerged to advocate some sort of transition out of America's foreign policy adventurism of the last 30 years. And Kyeyune argues that this is effectively the problem with this is not that realism wouldn't be a sensible way, kind of, using realpolitik as a mode of sort of deterrence to kind of minimize the wars that we get into, thinking seriously and soberly about our status as a great power among other powers. How do we, beat back the forces of hostility and tyranny and so forth? It's not that that wouldn't be a really great thing if we could do it, but that you can't run a country on realism. You can't legitimate a regime on realism, and America is not a realist country, as Kyune argues. Let me just read you a couple paragraphs from this piece so that you can get a flavor for it, and then we'll talk
I'll
about
just drop a pin quickly, Spencer, that it's the piece is called "The Tragedy of Foreign Policy Realism" in Compact Magazine from Malcolm Shiune, who's I'll just a quick background on Malcolm. A lot of our listeners probably know him. He's sort of made the rounds on podcasts, and he's a regular writer for Compact now. But he's ethnically a kind of half black Swede, former Marxist, Swedish guy. I'm pretty sure was born in Sweden. I'm almost positive. Speaks with a Swedish accent, and former leftist. He's like one of these many, like the Red Scare girls, kind of like who's that Australian socialist who's now a right winger. It's this huge category of sort of post-liberal lefties or former lefties who are writing interesting stuff and who've revolted against leftism for reasons of wokeness and all the rest, and so are trenchant critics, because often trenchant critics come from sort of outside intellectual spheres than normal American rightism. Go back and look at some of the National Review crowd in the mid-century, or the first generation neocons, etc. Anyway, Malcolm's worth a read. Interesting guy.
Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, that's helpful context. And let me now read to you just a couple paragraphs from this piece. The realists saw a country named America, a country with a tumultuous millenarian history since the time before its official founding, and assumed it to be another black box, a power like any other. They then assumed the box called America would continue to work as all boxes normally do, but the box named America refused to comply. This brings us to the true and profound meaning of Mearsheimer's statement that America is not a realist country. This meaning is not merely descriptive, but genuinely metaphysical. America is a country that cannot run on, legitimate itself by, understand itself through, or inspire a sense of genuine national cohesion through realism. So effectively, this is to portray realism as a philosophy that can describe countries from outside, but not from inside. And that from the inside, regimes need, you might say, I mean, this is what Sheyune calls magic, but it's something like a legitimating narrative, a sense of national pride, a mythos that conveys an ethos, describe it however you want. For us, it would be our kind of almost our civic religion of like the, great story of liberation from tyranny and the spreading of that liberation throughout the world, which is here identified with, the Iraq War and so on and so forth, and various problems that Colby is trying to scale back or avoid. And so I guess the crux of the argument here is that in order to be a realist, you can't really be an Americanist in the full sense. And therefore, like America, these sort of foreign policy adventures represented a last-ditch effort to keep that American magic alive. That there's something inherently kind of messianic about American magic, which is dying, has been dying for a while, and foreign wars were a kind of imperial attempt to get it back or to eke out a few more years worth of it. Now to the response, Colby took to Twitter, as he often does, and with, I think, remarkable sort of grace and openness, which the piece also showed, engages and disagrees that America cannot be realist. I'm just going to read you his conclusion. He cites a number of examples in which, he thinks American foreign policy was realist. Isolationism in the early republic was isolation from Europe, motivated by the logic America was better off focusing on North America and elsewhere. Talks about World War II and how long we took to get into it and so forth. I would say the biggest deviation from this tradition of practical, actual American statecraft has been the last 30 years. Why? The realist in me says we have been spoiled and made hubristic by unipolarity, but it does not need to be this way. American political culture will demand a more elevated rhetoric, but this does not require forfeiting an actually realist foreign policy. There is tension, to be sure, but I think American history shows it can be reconciled. He makes a distinction between practicing realism and legitimating your nation on realism, which I thought was an interesting and pretty good distinction. Finally, we should mention a piece, Realists Have Problems with Realism, by Claremont Fellowship alum Carlos Roa in National Interest, which kind of takes this conversation further. And I have talked already too much, so I guess what I'm going to do now is just open the floor and ask, what do you guys make of this whole debate? Why is it flaring up now? And who, if anybody, has the right of it? Or what is the right description of this situation?
I would say Malcolm and Elbridge are both wrong, but both in interesting ways. So I'll just add also that Elbridge Colby served in the Trump administration for a couple of years and was probably the major organizer of, in the bureaucratic sense, of the Trump administration's 2018 national security policy document, strategy document. Anyway, yeah, so I mean, Malcolm's mistake, well, his insight, which I think the main insight, which is good, and it's not new to him, but his terminology for it is sort of postmodern and maybe speaks to Zoomers in a certain way, is that, every regime needs some magic. And people know the phrase from Ben Shapiro long ago that, facts don't care about your feelings. And some wag on Twitter, I forget who did it, please forgive me if you're out there and listening, said actually, not to discount the stipulation by Shapiro that facts, of course, don't care about feelings and they're important. But in politics, actually, the more relevant formulation would be feelings don't care about your facts. So I think what Malcolm captures is the foreign policy or strategic equivalent, or the interaction between foreign policy and your domestic constituency of that phrase, which is feelings don't care about your facts in international relations, that every country needs some sort of weird blend of founding myth / principled ethos. I don't want to discount the term justice too much, but neither of them use that term, but I think it's more applicable, which is that every country needs to think what it's doing is right. And that includes in individual conduct. We're all disputing, and this is all the way back to Aristotle, right? Everyone's arguing about what's good and why. And the political community is organized to advance some notion of the good. And that's the question of justice. And the same is true in foreign policy. The collective action of a country has to have some self-justification. That's not just we get ours and you get screwed. However, often that might be kind of how things shake out in practice. So Malcolm calls it magic. I would call it the kind of founding principles or the justice of a place. Malcolm's wrong in the sense that he kind of implies but doesn't quite say that America was always going to be a crusading nation ideologically, that they had some sober heads that prevailed in the early years, but he can correct me if I'm wrong on Twitter, please do, Malcolm. But that in a way, the crusading ideological fanaticism of modern America was inevitable, but the content wasn't maybe inevitable, but to the extent that our ruling ethos now is spreading liberty in the Bush administration to the far corners of the earth. And now liberty, as understood by our ruling class, is sort of the trans flag and, personal sexual liberation and all that stuff. There's sort of a straight line you can draw from George W. Bush's certain attempt to revive the magic of America in a sort of imperialistic way, and our sort of corrupt magic that we're now exporting everywhere. And then the Elbridge Colby's mistake in responding is, and this is pointed out by Carlos Roa in Realists Have Problems with Realism, the piece that Spencer cites. Carlos gets this mostly right. I'm parroting him a bit, but with some terms, gleaned from our teaching here at Claremont and long study, which is to say that, yeah, Malcolm's wrong for the reasons I said. The Crusader nation was not inevitable from the founding. The alternative, although, is not realism. A lot of the founders were realistic without being ideologically realists in foreign policy. They weren't ideologues in this sort of thing. They thought that liberal nationalism, as they understood it from the founding of America, was the best way to organize a government. But in your conduct with other nations, you looked after your interests first. You respected their sovereignty, especially if they left you alone. But you didn't consider them a black box like the realists do. you understood the character of a nation by what sense of justice animated it. And blending all those things together, you had a realistic foreign policy rather than a hubristic one, or a one that gets beyond its skis or starts crusading and trying to colonize the world in its image of justice. So, there's a lot of wisdom on one side and on the other in the Malcolm-Colby exchange, but they both get America wrong. And Carlos Roa, and I would say, channeling our old colleague Angelo Codevilla, to mention him for a second time here, the better way to understand the founding is that it was a nice combination of liberal nationalism within a Westphalian system. That is, you respect the sovereignty of other nations. You realize you cannot colonize the world. Imperialism ultimately leads to despotism at home. However, it might offer you good things abroad. And that, there's a middle ground between these two things. And and then finally, I'll just say, and this is Angelo and this is Carlos in their critiques. If Angelo were alive, he'd critique it along the same lines, I think. The error, Elbridge Colby says the error started after the Cold War, but Angelo and Carlos both rightly identify it as the turn of the 20th century. And Carlos cites Albert Beveridge giving a speech about the Philippines. And this is right in the 1880s, especially the 1890s, as the America imperialistic facts start to grow out of winning the Spanish-American War, and then through progressivism at the turn of the 20th century. This is when the real change happens, which is to say, we now start talking as if, liberty is good at home, therefore it's good for the whole globe. Therefore, the U.S. must bring it to the whole globe. And it reaches its early apotheosis in Woodrow Wilson's messianic messages about World War I. And really that view of foreign policy, Angelo argued for many, many decades, has colonized all of mainstream thinking in American foreign policy. So in that sense, Elbridge Colby is right to be critical of that. He just misidentifies when it starts. And so I'll stop now. But that's like a 10-minute rambling version of what we teach at our fellowships about the corruption of American foreign policy, influenced by, among others, our friend Angelo Codevilla, and what Carlos got from our dearly departed friend Angelo at his fellowship. Go for it.
Well, I will try for a 9-minute rambling.
Please,
so that we stay on time here. Look, I think that the founders' sense of realism, of having a clear-sighted understanding of the geopolitical situation, I think was dominated by a more or less shared impression that political authority in the old world was kind of hosed. Like, the political predicaments and the instability of regimes and the struggle to reestablish political authority coming out of, frankly, the Reformation seemed intractable. Not a lot of room for all of these peoples to share. And, we saw the intractability of those problems extend right up through 1945 and beyond in some ways. But what brought it to an end is something that the founders would not have countenanced: weapons of mass destruction, a secret government, a state within a state in the United States that was basically a military scientific government, creating weapons capable of destroying millions of lives in an instant. And even that, okay, yes, that sort of finally knocked the soul out of Europe to such a degree that they kind of crawled into the EU and curled up into a ball and waited for the pain to go away, which, checking in on Europe, seems the pain has not yet gone away. So, not an unmitigated win there, even by the low standards of scorched earth policy. You look at Alexis de Tocqueville, he says, in that sense, some similar things about Latin America. Gosh, it sure seems like these people are just going to continuously have, quote unquote, democratic revolutions, permanent political instability, parties rising and falling, regimes rising and falling, basically replicating the problems of Europe. And a sensibility that the founders shared, despite myriad differences between Tocqueville and the founders, that there was really a genuine shot at reestablishing a kind of durable political authority in the United States that, yes, other nations could learn from, could study, could see the different risks and rewards, could see kind of see a little bit into the future by looking at America. Sure. But the founders did not have a very generous or optimistic view of how political life and regimes in the old world were going to carry on. And I think in large measure that skepticism has proven out to be true. Somewhere along the way, after America became Zeus, throwing lightning bolts at whoever they decided was unjust and killing them, so usurping the place of God, in at least the pagan God, in that way, it became very easy for Americans to say, like, well, we're just, not only are these other places kind of irredeemable and stuck in a regime loop that is now intensifying to a degree that threatens us, well, we're just going to break those regimes and we're going to just remake the world in our image as best as we can. It might not be perfect. It might not be bloodless, but that's what we're going to do. And, we're reaping the consequences of that approach. And not just in terms that realists have always focused on, hard power, material, whatever, sometimes economics, but in terms that realists don't get really squeamish around. What's the realist account of international wokeness and the Asian backlash against it? That's terrain they don't really want to go on, but it's essential to understanding, how America could have mutated to a point that, it really is, at least as the sitting administration sees it, it really is just sort of like, killer robots with that flag plastered all over them. How did it come to this? Well, part of that is a reflection of the real impasse that Europe and the, post-European old world had reached coming out of the Reformation and going into colonialism and all that. And part of that is a reflection on, the ways in which America sort of drank its own Kool-Aid and became very prideful. And, it's easier to go in search of monsters to destroy if, in a sense, you become a monster first. The bloodlust rises, the megalomania sets in. And all that's incredibly foreign and alien, and I think would be repulsive to the founders, even if Jefferson was in the tank for sort of global enlightenment and revolution of a sort, democratic sort. Where does that leave the realists? Not in a great spot. They continue to, as they say on the internet, have some good points, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. Not sufficient. Maybe a necessary analysis. In the end, not sufficient. And if they're unable to pay close attention to the ways in which the spiritual and the technological are continuing to eat the political, even the military, in terms of hard power and materiel, they're going to continue to expose themselves even to bad and off-base criticism.
I have little or perhaps nothing to add to that.
James, I have bludgeoned Seth into, speechlessness. I'm joking, of course.
No, I think we're sitting at your feet and learning. Besides which, in fact, I think we should probably move on. The other thing that we wanted to touch on was the kind of back and forth of pride, but I think we're going to save that for another day because speaking of hubris and pride, there are some interesting developments ongoing in this month, this bacchanalian month of abjection and ever more bizarre sexual transgression. There's some, I would say, some white pills and some black pills coming down the pike. Our listeners will probably have been paying attention to them, but we're going to save this for another day, I think, and just continue to watch and see whether the Starbucks taking down its pride decorations of it all or the Biden Twitter account declaring America a nation of pride of it all will be winning out. Much to consider, much to discuss at a future time, so tune in next week. With that, it is time for our weekly segment, Read the Damn Site, where we invite you to do just that at AmericanMind.org. where we publish many articles each day. In fact, we like to pick one piece from the week that we've particularly enjoyed, each of us, and so we are going to go ahead and do that. I would like to highlight for you a piece called "Who's on the Other End of the Chatbot" by Sam Woods. We've been running a few pieces on AI as part of what will become a feature, and I asked Sam to write for us a kind of like positive use case for AI and large language models piece, because there's so much doomerism around this tech, so much kind of over the top obscurantism, and Sam writes well about it and has a lot to say about, what's currently out there, how you might use it well or badly, what has to happen for the worst case scenario not to play out. And I just like pieces that are kind of less about all the terrible things that are definitely going to go horribly wrong, and more about, well, what can we do and or hope for in this domain? So it's called "Who's on the Other End of the Chatbot." It's by Sam Woods. And of course, it's at AmericanMind.org. Go check it out. Seth, what do you got?
I was really thrilled and impressed with this piece that just went up on the site by our friend T.T. Exolancic, an author whom we have published, probably half a dozen times. The item is called "Genital Mutilation for the Masses." And the author essentially, I asked her to write this, and she really knows a lot about trans issues and what she calls, the gender ideology and gender atheism. So I asked her to really go deep into all of the various, mutilations and kind of ghastly horrors that are lumped under the rubric gender affirmation, namely the surgeries. So basically, she goes into the most horrid details about medioplasty and, all the various, vaginoplasty and the construction of neophalluses and where they harvest the skin and what happens to it, and all the complications that almost invariably arise, and what it's like to live afterward. It's fascinating. It's horrible. It's a long piece. It's about 3,300 words, but it's really, really interesting to see what it is that these surgeons, a surgeon is like a technician. It's like, someone who's like, oh, well, what can I do? A surgeon sees every patient as, an opportunity to experiment, basically. So, to them, it's like Legos or something. Like, what can I do? How can I make this urethra function? What can I do with this spongiform body? It gets just like grisly. So it's a great piece. Genital mutilation for the masses.
Yeah, this stuff is it's easy to be of two minds about it, because it's so gruesome and horrifying what it actually entails that you just don't even want to think about it, but you kind of have to, especially because the depictions around this stuff are so dishonest. That whole kind of movement depends on these glossy photographs of extremely expensive versions of these surgeries that obviously would never go into the horrors and the flesh hacking and it reminds me a little bit of the pro-life movement's sort of efforts to show what abortion really looks like, to just confront people with the physical horrors that make it really hard to euphemize or deny the fact that this is a human body being horribly violated. Like, on Twitter lately, there have been a lot of pictures shared that, again, are hard to look at, but kind of necessary and needful to look at, so that we know what we're really talking about and we don't slip into complacency about this stuff. So yeah, it's a great piece and worth reading, but maybe steel yourself before you do genital mutilation.
Spencer, if I could, I just wanted to add quickly, it's sort of very much in line with our themes. And I would just submit that I mean, well, first of all, this shows the great ancient wisdom of the Hippocratic Oath, which is first do no harm, that, practitioners of the medical arts took. And also, I would submit that a society a society divorced from any notion of the soul or God or eternal things or natural right, take your pick, secular or divine, something like medical science turns into what Seth called it, which it was not itself understanding for thousands of years, as primitive as it may have been thousands of years ago, which is just kind of a technique. And that I think a society, this is why a lot of us are so exercised about this trans and transhumanism issue. And I think, a lot of our friends on the left are baffled by this. They think it's mean-spirited or something. But our fundamental point, I think, is that a society that calls this kind of thing healthcare is not that far from a society that could call murder justice. And that's what worries a lot of us. So I'll just drop that quickly.
Yeah, the unbounded kind of vision of reality as an expanse of molecules, and therefore the human person is an expanse of flesh. Like that is kind of the wages of, it's the wages of materialism. James, what do you got?
I got Day Trippers by Auguste Myrat, Silicon Valley's disastrous dance with psychedelic drugs. Not everyone, but many, many, many people in the Valley are on drugs, psychedelic drugs, psychotropics, like psych meds, and then, of course, the near ubiquitous Adderall. It is not entirely responsible for the work product of Silicon Valley, but it's a lot. It's not entirely responsible for the prevalence of cults and the generally, ridiculous faith that technology will somehow midwife a kind of mind-blowingly amazing spiritual experience. That's where that comes from in large part. And it's just hiding in plain sight. Since the pandemic, more and more Americans have turned to drugs. More and more Americans have died of drugs. And if we can't confront the reality of what's going on, it's going to be, needlessly confusing, and it's going to be hard for us to understand. A friend of mine who came to America to work after a brief period of time for Google was excited because he expected the most American of Americans to be at the biggest and most important of American companies at Google. And he got in there and was shocked. He was like, where are all the Americans? Not because they were all Indian, but because these people did not talk like Americans. They didn't think like Americans. They didn't seem to care about what Americans cared about. They didn't act like Americans. It was a huge culture shock. And the discovery of tech culture and the depths of the difference that were already present there in the 2010s from the garden variety of American, well, that has only accelerated and deepened, and a lot of it has to do with with what exactly. I mean, this is the puzzle. Is what is the payoff? Is it escape? Is it pleasure? Is it just hitting the dopamine receptors? Is it part of a spiritual quest? Is it attempt to leap out of your humanity? All these questions, and something that's not really discussed. But it does seem to, it's reaching the point where it's in order to function in this environment, you must be on drugs of some kind or the other. And what does that say about what kind of environment that is and how hostile it is to just generic human life? All interesting questions. And the piece is quite practical. You're not going to feel like you're on drugs if you read the piece. You're not going to be drifting off into some parallel universe. So Day Trippers, check it out.
Last but not least, Mr. President, what do you got?
Well, it's the end of our fiscal year here at the Claremont Institute. So I've been spending all week, most of my days, going through annual reviews of people, a thankless task, but a necessary one and a good one. So I have read nothing of the damn site. So I'm going to, once again, stretch Spencer's capacity for being appalled and disgusted.
Boy.
And innovate once again. And cite not a Claremont review.
This is a rough episode for me, guys.
Cite not a Claremont Review Books piece, not an American Mind piece, but our colleague Christopher Caldwell writing for a different publication outside of the corporation. It's
here at the end of our fiscal year, we advise you to go somewhere other than Claremont
some other
Institute
damn
for your
site.
best content. Yeah, exactly.
But no, I just it's I think one of the services of this podcast, among others, and actually just even amongst my networks of friends and acquaintances who aren't immersed in all this stuff all the time like we are, is to just point out pieces of good and interesting writing that we come across because we're just immersed in this all day. And so our colleague Christopher Caldwell, contributing editor at the Claremont Review Books, always writes very interestingly about foreign things. Chris knows Italy well. He knows France well. He knows Hungary and Eastern Europe well. He knows Europe well in general, the continent, and has a lot of friends over there. But all of that sort of long time learning and immersion informs great pieces like this from Chris called "The Death of a Statesman" at Compact Magazine. It's really not an essay. It's a short eulogy. It's probably 1,000 words of Silvio Berlusconi, one of the more colorful populist figures of modern times. Let me just read the opening paragraph. It's a classic Caldwell open. And it's behind a paywall, but shoot, I was going to help them with their promo, but I won't because it'll expire by the time I say this. But anyway, it's behind the paywall. Compact's a good magazine, has a lot of interesting writing. We've cited it now twice here, so go subscribe if you feel like it. But this is Chris about Berlusconi. In 2010, when he was under investigation for the notorious all-night parties that briefly brought the expression bunga bunga into most of the languages of Western Europe, Italian Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi, then 74, remarked that chasing teenage girls around at his age might not be to everyone's liking, but it had an upside. Quote, "It beats being gay." 2 years had passed since he had opined during a news conference in Moscow that he and Russian Premier Dmitry Medvedev would have an easy time working with the newly elected American President Barack Obama, who was, quote, "young, handsome, and tanned." By then, people had nearly forgotten that time in 2002 when Berlusconi had made the two-fingered cuckold gesture behind Spanish Foreign Minister Josep Piqué during a group photo, during a group photo. So, and then Chris, that sort of catches your attention. And then Chris goes through the seriousness of Berlusconi. He's a harbinger of Trump, as Chris says in this piece, in that in the 90s, he sort of built a political party and empire quickly on his own in a way you can only really do in parliamentary systems. Out of his, he'd built many companies. He'd gotten wealthy. He was a media mogul, a self-made man, very well educated. But as you can tell from that opening stuff, a kind of earthy populist. And he took this odd phenomenon in Italy of the post-Cold War era, ushering in oddly the quick turnaround and almost triumph of communists, or the socialist communists in Italy, with the help of the media and the judiciary. And Berlusconi stood in their way and arrested the takeover of that country by kind of socialistic technocracy. And it does a lot of Caldwellian themes. The eulogy is crisp and infused with Caldwell's sense of just taking a quite different view of post-Cold War Europe, populism, this relative position of modern sort of acceptable, neoliberal bureaucratic Europe, and the people who opposed it, many of whom are colorful figures, and one of whom, perhaps one of the most colorful, was Silvio Berlusconi. So go check it out.
Nothing better than a Caldwell profile of a European populist.
Yeah.
I'm not even joking. It's just one of his many, many strong suits. So I will forgive you, Ryan, for
thanks.
plugging somebody else's magazine. Just this once. But that doesn't mean that I am going to refrain from plugging all of our Claremont stuff shamelessly. First of all, thank you very much, all of you, for listening to the Roundtable. If you want to learn more about the stuff that we do, we've already mentioned one way you can do that, and that's to go to AmericanMind.org and read the damn site. But there's plenty of other good stuff that we put out. Our big sister publication, the Claremont Review of Books, is available at ClaremontReviewOfBooks.com. And as Ryan mentioned, of course, all throughout the year is a good time to donate to support us. But now is especially a good time. If you go to Claremont.org/donate, we will be so grateful for anything you want to do to help support us in our mission of recovering and defending the American idea. You can also check out our DC-based Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. And of course, if you are listening to my voice and you have not already subscribed, rated, and shared this podcast, what the heck is wrong with you? Please do, if you would, give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. It really helps to spread the word about the show, grow our listenership. At the very least, if you have anything even remotely negative to say about us, keep it off of your Apple Podcast review. If you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. And with that, thanks to our engineering and production crew, Jake Gannon, Logan Zeppieri, and Blaze Ebener. And thanks once again to all of you for listening. We will talk to you next week.